Changing Our Story with the Reverend Dr. Terrance Gallagher. Reverend Gallagher is an ordained minister in the UCC, educated originally as an engineer, Terry following a 30-year career as a chemical industrial manufacturing executive, answered the call to the ministry. He attained a Master of Divinity from the Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Chicago Theological Seminary. He served as a local church pastor in Michigan for 7 years. And in response to the escalating double-edged global crisis of unsustainable economics and ecological destruction, he has focused his ministry efforts in serving the greater society as a public theologian. His current ministry is faith-based ecological justice education, advocacy, and action. You can find his efforts working towards a just, sustainable world on the web, in the church, in community meetings, in legislative offices, and on the public square. Please welcome Terry Gallagher.
Good morning. Good morning. My nephew, who is much younger than I am, says, "You got to be ready. There are going to be a bunch of old people there." I said, "I know old people." And I feel at home because you guys come to the meeting as late as everybody I preach to comes to church. That long introduction was a way of explaining that I'm kind of a weird duck. As an engineer and as someone that understands science, as somebody that's embraced that we've made some terrible mistakes along this way. But I want to spend some time with you this morning exploring that. And in order to do that, there are going to be times you're going to want to hold on to your chairs, right? Because they're going to challenge a little bit of our assumptions. So, can we change our story? Is it possible to change how we view life on this home we call Earth? Can we do it soon enough to matter? We are people of stories. Stories inform our lives. They tell us what makes for a good life and what makes for a not so good life. Stories tell us who to love, who to hate. Stories tell us what to acquire and what to pass by. Stories tell us who's not quite fully human and who's more. Stories we begin to accumulate when we're what? My youngest granddaughter is 7 months old, and she's already picking up stories, even though she can't talk about it. We pick up the stories, and they form our lives. We hear them on our parents' knees. We learn them in our neighborhood. So your zip code, your neighborhood is different than mine growing up. We have some different stories. We get stories from our education. We get stories from our life experiences. We get stories from those that we fall in relationship with. We get stories from our career. We get stories from the bumps and the bruises we experience along life's path. All too often, though, the stories that form our lives are given to us by major media, by great psychological powers that we get imprinted with stories and we don't even know that they're controlling our lives. And so to change, we really got to be open to examining these stories. Anybody know Rebecca Solomon? She's a fantastic wordsmith. Let's talk with her. We tell ourselves stories in order to live or to justify taking lives, even our own by violence or by numbness and the failure to live. Tell ourselves stories that save us, the stories that are quicksand in which we thrash and the well in which we drown, stories of justification of the cursedness of luck and star-crossed love, or versions clad in the cynicism that is at times a very elegant garment. We think we tell stories, but stories often tell us to love or to hate, to see or be blind. Often, too often, stories saddle us, ride us, whip us onward, tell us what to do, and we do it without questioning. The task of learning to be free requires learning to hear them, to pause, hear silence, to name them, and then become the storyteller. Most of us have a degree of obliviousness, willful or otherwise. We know the facts, but we don't always realize them with the imaginative, emotional engagement that makes them vivid forces in deciding factors. If I'm successful at all today, some of you will tell this story. So, we have three major stories that form the core of our society. We might not recognize them until we pause, but they form our economic system, they form what we consider to be the greatest society in the world. And these three stories are killing us. They're killing the world. What are they? The first one is the concept that the earth is too big. The earth is so vast, there's no way that human beings can hurt it. This is a story that we use to justify why there has to be millions of smokestacks and billions of exhaust pipes. It's too big, we can't hurt it. In our lifetime, all those with gray hair or would have gray hair if they didn't synthetically alter it, in our lifetime we have tripled the world's population, but we've increased the amount of pollution we put up in the air each and every day by sixfold, 600% increase. The world is too big. We can't hurt it. It's a lie. The second story builds on that. The second story says there's always more. This comes out of the American Go West young man. There's always great adventures to be had. There's always more. You don't need to worry about what you're consuming. There's always more. We get exposed to 10,000 to 12,000 commercials a day to tell you there's always more. And if you're not happy, it's because you don't have more. You want to be happy? Go buy something. Still not happy? Then you bought the wrong thing. You got to buy something else. There's always more. There's always more. The third story builds on that, and it might be even the most difficult one for us to deal with. And that's the supremacy of the individual. That the individual trumps societal needs. This is how we have billionaires. The supremacy of the individual. This is how 65 human beings have more wealth than 3.6 billion human beings. And we find that's okay. Supremacy of the individual. Everybody remember this picture? This should have changed that first story. When we first saw this picture 40 years ago, when we saw just how small and how fragile the earth is, I should have made that first story go away, but it didn't. We just shelved it. We let that story continue to dominate us. Instead of realizing that what we have is very small and very precious. We are founded a society based on the burning of fossil fuels. Dig it up out of the ground, pump it out of the ground, suck it out of the ground, burn it, throw it up in the air, don't worry about it. The earth is too big, we can't hurt it. Our whole economy is based on this. It is a lie. We're destroying it. Everywhere you look, we have smokestacks and exhaust pipes. You see this real thin layer in there? That's the atmosphere that we think is too big, that we can't possibly hurt. Carl Sagan once said, if you take a basketball and you say that's the earth, and you put saran wrap on the basketball, that would be the atmosphere that protects us. 14 and 15 hottest years on record have all occurred since 2001. Hottest year ever? Last year. Hottest month? February. This slide is 3 weeks old. It's out of date. March data just came out and moves February record out. Industry didn't move to China and the Far East simply because it was cheap labor. They moved because there were no restrictions on how you can pollute. 80% of the water is contaminated. 50% of the farmland is contaminated. Did we ever think that there's an ethics to what we buy from where it's sourced from? Heat waves. 2,330 people died last year in India. The heat wave in India has already started for this season. Pakistan. The terrible storms that hit the Philippines. and the graveyards that result from those storms. The gravest effects of all attacks on the environment are suffered by the poorest. That was from Pope Francis. And that's very true. This is a question of justice. The people who are feeling this and suffering the first and the most had nothing to do with causing the problem. We caused it. Our story. Great floods, great droughts, great storms, extreme rains. There's a problem here. You see, none of the rich nations of the world are listed in the top 10 that are suffering. And that transfers to our ethics. Because we're not still experiencing it, we can deny it. The rise in extreme temperatures and floods and storms and so on. One 140 cities rationed water. 20% were affected by drought last year. How do you feed? How do you bring water to your family? One of the things we're not anticipating very well, because we're not in their shoes, is what happens when you fish your starving kids. What happens when you're looking at your grandkids who don't have water? What do? Well, you protest. Then when the protests don't work, you get desperate. The Syrian civil war came as a result of 11 years of drought. 300,000 people have died in that civil war because the drought turned 60% of their farms into desert. It killed 80% of the animals. It drove 1.5 million people into Syria's already crowded cities. That's where we got the European refugee crisis from. Desperate people trying to find a place where their families could have food, could have water. What we're seeing now is the tip. The deluge is still to come. The Department of Defense recognizes it. I don't care what certain senators, like the senator with the snowball says. Our Department of Defense is recognizing that climate change is the #1 threat enhancer in the world. It's a medical emergency. Top 10 cities at risk for sea level rise. None of ours in terms of people. Sea level rise doesn't just bring flooding, but it brings the salt water, and that turns the soil so that you can't grow anything again. Anybody recognize the story? Easter Island. Easter Island used to be covered with trees. Covered with trees. But they got it in their heads, as human beings do, that they needed these statues to ward off other tribes, to appeal whatever they wanted to appeal. But the problem is, in order to harvest those statues, to carve those statues out of the stone, they needed to have tools that could cut through the stone. And in order to have the tools that would be hard to cut through the stone, they had to burn the trees. And then these things weigh so much, they had to cut down more trees in order to roll these statues out to the coast. And eventually, they cut down the last tree. And then they found out you can't live without trees. That was their story. Can we change our story before we repeat what they've done? You guys remember this? Look quick. I'm there. Oh, you missed me.
There we are. It's the Ethical Society.
All right. I was stunned at how many showed up on that day
What day?
for the climate march. So, last December in Paris, I was there for the gathering of the nations to deal with the climate crisis, to decide, is it real? Is it happening? Is it caused by us? And should we act? This was the 21st time that the nations have come together for this very issue. 20 times they've gone home in failure, but this time, maybe there's hope. So it's the best of conferences, the worst of conferences. Everybody remember Dickens? Yes. It is very much like that. Now everybody came to the table with the same cards. Look at the CO2 emissions per person. Everybody wants to complain about China. You don't have the ethical basis to do that. India. So, there were 3 venues all connected to each other, one for the government delegates, one for the interested parties, one for the public area. In the public area where I was as a witness, there were 1,000 presentations. It was kind of neat to be in and hear these different voices. Bill McKibben talked about it being a moment of time when physics and poetry comes together. The undeniable effect of physics. And the question of what does it take for us to change our story? For us to accept that we're causing destruction. And maybe it's the poets that will be able to reach us when nothing else can. So, those are all shoes, okay? Because the Paris was happening 2 weeks after the terrorist attack. And so it was under military rule. There were no marches allowed, so instead the protesters used to fill the plaza with shoes as a sign of protest. The Secretary General of the UN shoes is there. An artist brought in icebergs and put them in kind of like a circle, like Stonehenge, with a meaning, will we agree before all the ice on the earth melts or not? There were public trials of Exxon for crimes against humanity. There was a greeting in the Arc de Triomphe. There was a protest that couldn't be stopped. There were public actions to try and move the politics, to try and pressure it. So 350 rented an empty warehouse and conducted a public trial of Exxon. It was kind of neat to see. Public demonstration was banned, but on the Friday of the second week when the conference was supposed to be over, the protesters let the government know, you can say no, but we're still going to march. You're going to have to arrest us all. And so the government, being smart enough, says, we're going to let this go on. We're going to prove this. So, it came down to a word or a number. Shall or should? 2 degrees or 1.5, what's the big deal? It's simply words on the page, right? The nations of the world came together with a previous agreement, or actually I should say the rich nations of the world came together with a previous agreement, that it's okay to allow the earth to heat up 2 degrees centigrade. The thing to realize is 2 degrees centigrade is not a scientific analysis of what's safe for humanity. It's based on what's comfortable for rich nations. How much we can heat up the earth before the rich nations pay too much of a price. All of the damage that I was showing you in those previous slides is from 1 degree rise. So the developing countries started a movement called 1.5 to stay alive. Because they're saying, look at what's happening at 1 degree. If we let it go up to 2 degrees, we won't be alive. If we're island nations, we're going to be underneath water. If we're desert nations, we're going to be without water. If we're nations where there's water, we're going to be flooded out. If we're nations that are poor, we're going to be starved out. We can't allow it to go to 2 degrees centigrade. even if it does make you guys less comfortable in how to deal with it. So it was a bit of a shock when in the opening speech of the conference, the President of France endorsed the 1.5 to stay alive. It didn't quite make it into the final agreement. The goal in the final agreement is still 2 degrees with a target of as close to 1.5 as we can get. So the mention is still there. What's the difference in half a degree? Hundreds of millions of lives. They're not our lives, but they're human lives. To stop the heating of Earth at 1.5 degrees requires an urgency be brought to this that has not yet been voiced. It requires a response to the burning of fossil fuels that requires a level of effort that we only have done previously in our history to go to war. It means recognizing that hundreds of millions of lives are worth saving and not through efforts of war. So it means that we have to stop burning fossil fuels. There's no way to sugarcoat that. There is no way to change that story. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. That big #1 story, that's a lie. We have to stop. We have to stop this idea that we can dig it up out of the ground, burn it, and throw it up in the atmosphere, and there's no penalty for it. 8 million people a year are already dying from air pollution, just simply air pollution. Hundreds of thousands are dying from the climate changes. It'll be hundreds of millions that die if we don't change. We have to change the story while those in this room are still alive. This is not a future problem. This is a now problem. We've been letting ourselves off the hook. We say this is a problem for our grandkids. If we leave it for that, our grandkids don't have a chance. We have to stop it now. It's the physics. Somebody will argue with that and will say, well, I don't like that. I don't like that. That's our story you're sharing with us. I don't like some of the physical laws of the universe either. I don't like gravity. I don't. As I get older, it's made me short. It makes my joints ache. But here's the thing. The physical laws of the universe don't require my approval. They simply don't. So I live on a 3rd floor condo. If I step off my balcony because I don't like gravity, I will soon be awakened to the fact that gravity wins. The physics of the atmosphere win. It's the same physical laws of the universe. We have to change. How fast? If we're really concerned, we need to stop in this country in the next 5 years. You know, that's not possible. It's not possible. If we want to save hundreds of millions, then we have to stop by 2030. But we have to stop. We have the technology, we can do it. But we have to change the story. So, that was the fight over the number, 1.5 or 2. Then came the fight over shall or should. What's in the word? What's in the word? The document that the nations were going to agree on had the word shall. And the American delegation, recognizing that we're never going to get this through Congress, says it can't be shall, we've got to make it should, so we have the weasel words that we don't need to have congressional approval in order to sign this. And the French, being the diplomats of the French Char, took it on the chin and they said, it's all our fault. It was always should. We lost it in translation. And so shall went out the window and should came in. What's the difference? There's no enforcement of the law. This is all voluntary. This is all, we'll do what we want when we feel comfortable doing it. The only thing that changes that is if we get busy. if we bring the political pressure to change that. This is where the actions of people of faith and people of moral ethics and people who actually care about more than simply themselves comes into a critical role. It's up to us to move the lived reality of our world through our critiques and our public actions in the naming and the shaming of the evil that is perpetuated in our name. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It takes lived action. So, what are the results? Governments have all agreed it's time to drastically reduce global emissions. Let's not minimize that. That's huge. They've met 20 times, and 20 times they came away with failure. But on the 21st time, 195 nations plus the European Union all agreed climate change is real, it's happening now, it's human caused, and we got to move to act it. That's positive. That's very positive. It sends a strong signal to government planners, investors, and citizens in the world that we urgently need to dramatically decrease carbon pollutions. Okay, you can see that with the stock market decline that happened for fossil fuels after that conference, with the coal companies that are now declaring bankruptcy. This had some effect. 180 countries representing 98% of the global emissions officially put forward their voluntary cuts. Okay, 180 nations came to the table and said, this is what we're willing to commit to. And then they agreed. They have to fund the developing nations. We've already exhausted all the pushing you can throw up. We have to fund their energy. 1.3 billion people still don't have electricity. They can't get it by burning carbon. And so we have to fund renewable energy. Here's the downside. Those voluntary cuts results in 3.5 degrees centigrade rise, not 1.5. So it's a tale of two worlds. The best of times is the worst of times. We have mistakenly founded the economy of our modern society on the burning of fossil fuels. It's as bad a mistake as when we founded our economy on the enslavement of human beings. People of ethics were required to respond to slavery. People of ethics are required to respond to the crisis of global warming. It's time for the era of burning fossil fuels to end. So, at this point in time, when I'm giving these presentations, people want to go home, go back to bed, pull the cover over their heads, right? Because it feels like despair. So I have 42 action tips that are on a handout on the back sheet. They're in 3 columns. The left-hand column is toe dipping. The middle column is wading a little deeper, and the right column is immersed as a way of life. You're going to look at some of these, you're going to say, oh, this is so simple, I don't know why you even bother putting them on a piece of paper. And you're going to look at some of the other items and say, you know what? You're nuts. If you think I'm going to do that, you're nuts. My challenge to you is to look at the paper, mark where you're at, and choose a couple or 3 that you're not yet doing and see if you can do it. Thomas King, who is a Native American writer, says, that's the new story. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Tell it to friends, turn it into a television movie, put it on a t-shirt, or just forget it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if you'd only heard the story. Because you've heard it now. So, what's the story you're going to tell your children? If you're a gray hair, maybe the first thing you're going to need to do is confess to them that we were wrong. The story we passed on to them was wrong. And we have to change. It's not too big to hurt. We've proven that. We've heard it bad. It's time to stop. Thank you.
Stopping the source of energy with carbon
Good question. There are leading experts that say nuclear is going to have to be enabled in order for us to reach it. I don't have to agree with that, but James Hansen, who is the world's leading climate scientist before he retired, holds that position. The thing to bear in mind is, number one, wind. There's enough wind energy to power what we need 40 times over, okay? But that pales in comparison to solar, all right? Enough energy comes from 1 hour of sunlight a year to power all that we need. There's 8,760 hours. There's the energy source. But we're smart enough, we can use wind and wave and geothermal. We've got the technology. My youngest son has got a PhD in chemical engineering and works at Argonne National Laboratories on the new battery technology. And every time I see him, I say, "You've got to work faster. You got to work faster. We need them batteries." Stephen Chu, the former energy secretary, came to Chicago and he gave on a talk where he's now going around to all of the energy CEOs and telling them, you know, this is coming. Rooftop solar and storage, battery storage is real. The technology is here. It's coming, and your very best customers are going to be the first ones to embrace it. And he gets 3 reactions from the electrical CEOs. The first reaction is deer in the headlight. The second reaction is, we know it's coming. In fact, we're going to help. We're going to offer to put the solar on the rooftops and sell the electricity from that rooftop stuff at a reduction. He says, but the third response, which is unfortunately the most common response, is we're going to fight them. We're going to fight them every step of the way, because every time we can delay it from happening, we can make more money. And so we're going to have tariffs passed, and we're going to have zoning restrictions passed, and we're going to have access passed so that we can throw out the roadblocks. There's only one counter to that, and that's the vote. I was at a community college giving a presentation this past Wednesday. It's Earth Month. I'm in big demand. I've got a dozen presentations. Anyway, a young man stood up and said, well, what should we do about that government? And I said, you got to vote. And all you who don't vote, you need to shut up. Because all your talking doesn't do anything. You got to vote. That's your first thing. The second thing is you have to become a PIA. A PIA. A pain in the ass to your local congressman. Right? He's got to know your name. He's got to be rolling his eyes when he sees that you're on his appointment calendar. He's got to know that it's not the oil-funded lobbyists that count, but it's constituents that count. And so we've got to do that. So the technology is there. We can do this. We can do this. We actually can do it. It's a lie told by the story that keeps us from doing it.
Next question.
This is 2 questions. One is, what do you say when people say climate change is cyclical, that this is a naturally occurring thing and that it will occur no matter what we do?
Yeah, I had a climate denier at the Joliet meeting at the junior college that I was at, and it was rather obvious that there was nothing that I was going to say that was going to pierce his. When somebody's dealing from an ideology, they're not exposed, they're not accepting of rational facts. So they're just not going to. The only thing that's going to change them is if they have a personal experience of tragedy, or somebody that they trust shares with them why it matters to them. The science, the figures, the math, the physics, that doesn't matter. In fact, studies tell us that when somebody has an ideology, if I confront them with facts that disproves the ideology, it makes them stronger in that ideology. Because the only reason I'm telling them is because I'm evil. So, there's about 5 or 6% of the nation that holds this position, very strong position. They have a much bigger voice because they're well funded. You know, the fossil fuel companies are funding them and they're giving them lots of $1 million. And the reason they're doing it is because if we're successful and 80% of the fossil fuels stay in the ground, $20 trillion, 20 trillion with a T, gets wiped off their balance books. That's why They're spending millions of dollars to oppose this. So, somebody that really believes that, just tell you that I do it because I'm concerned for my kids. All right, second question.
Well, this is second one arises from this one. Is there any truth to that at all, that climate change is cyclical or happen anyway?
No, weather is cyclical. Weather is cyclical. Climate change is not. Other than millions of years cycle, the difference is we're doing it at 100 times or 1,000 times faster than the Earth cycles because of what we're doing with carbon. So it is true if you go back millions of years. Right now you have to go back more than 35 million years to find a time when CO2 was this heavy in the atmosphere. We're driving this. We're driving mass extinction. We're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction of the Earth. Right? And we're doing it in many ways. We've cut down 50% of the forests in the world. Trees breathe in CO2, they breathe out oxygen.
Next question.
The truth is that if human intervention was eliminated, the planet would be heading for an ice age right now. It would be totally the opposite direction.
On a long time frame.
Yeah.
Based on the elliptical pattern.
Geologic time frame.
Yeah.
One more question. Virginia?
Yes. This is a personal question.
Okay.
When you were a minister in a church, what church were you in?
I had 2 churches. I'm a United Church of Christ pastor, and so in downriver Detroit, I had 2 churches. One in Gibraltar and one in Flat Rock, Michigan. These were areas that used to be very heavily manufacturing centers, and because the industry moved out, then the population fell on hard times. And so in the one church I started a food pantry, and the other church I started a weekly meal. And when I was starting these, here's the story, right? When I was starting to Feed the Hungry programs, I got told there are no hungry. It's the suburbs. And so there were no hungry, but 4 times I had to draw in the boundaries because we couldn't come up with enough food, even though I was moving thousands of pounds. We see what we're willing to see, and we hear what we're willing to hear. And it isn't until we pause and listen to new voices at a deep, deep level and let their story stretch the boundaries of our story that we have a chance at a new and a greater understanding. Yes?
Well, Sandy happened, and I don't see any acceleration in renewable energy development.
There actually is. You don't hear about it, but there is. We're at an exponential point on all the renewable energies. Solar just became grid parity in 47 out of the 50 states. Right? Wind technology, because of the heights and going offshore. We are poised where if we funded it, this would blow. This would be World War II. You know, in World War II, where we changed all the automobile plants over to making tanks and fighter planes and machine guns and cannons. Can we do that for life rather than for death? That's the question. Can we change over to having windmill factories and solar cell factories and geothermal factories? Or do we only do this for war? That's going to be the defining story for our generation. What did you do when you first knew this was happening? Tell me, Grandpa. What did you do when you knew we were destroying my future? Thanks for your time.